Hello, I'm Layne Hartsell with the Korea IT Times. I'm here with philosopher David Long, the founder of Non-Reductionist theory or practice. And I want to go in a little bit deeper into what non-reductionism is. And I'm going to actually start out with a question to you. But anyway, welcome and good to see you again, David. Hadn't seen you in a while.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the talk.
Yeah. David and I have been interacting on Facebook and we talk occasionally on video in private about the actual philosophical concepts, and we go into a bit of detail, which I'll ask him to do a little bit tonight so you guys can understand what we're talking about here. I want to start off with something that I said in a recent lecture that I gave, that the world looks like a kind of shattered windshield. So if you picture a shattered windshield, I mean, I have all of these little squares, these little cubes, and the world looks like that today. I think it's fair to say. And I think that Picasso caught on to this with the Cubist thinking, and I think that and painting. I think that Picasso realized that what was going on, and this out of that came the Cubism. The story I'm telling, maybe I got this from Ken Wilber, somebody that we both read, the American philosopher of integral theory, and someone that you've studied and you've critiqued, and you've developed your non-reductionist theory and a more, what it looks to me like a balanced, holistic philosophy with a good analytical component and the ethics. So I'm going to just open with this, and I want to give you a chance to explain, tell us how you got involved and who were your influences.
I would say I'm a huge fan of Joseph Campbell, a big fan of his work. I think that he was one of the first people to really do an implicit, overarching integration of religion through a psychoanalytical lens, taking on the work of Jung's dream interpretation and applying it to mythology. The main quote that he would always say is the Jung quote, "Dreams are private myths and myths are public dreams." So he had this like very skillful, fair, overarching way of understanding religion in a more transrational, poetic, metaphorical kind of way. And so I also really resonated with the work of Ken Wilber when I first came across it. I thought it was a very cool and interesting project. I especially liked that there was simplicity on the other side of complexity. There was an attempt to create a map of reality that could fit on one page. So these things like the map and the basic elements from integral theory are things that non-reductionism include as well. Although we think about the elements differently and we have other meta level distinctions in relation to them. These elements are some of the basic factors at play. Maybe a helpful analogy would be to say something like there's a difference between ingredients and the recipe, right? You can take a lot of the same ingredients and use a different recipe and come up with a completely different dish. Like pizza and pasta might use a lot of the same ingredients, but the recipe is different, and so the final product is different. The basic elements that we have in common are quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types, but non-reductionism also includes modes and roles, which has to do with self-mastery. And we can talk more about these elements later, but what I really think is exciting about meta theory in general is how accessible it is. And instead of getting bogged down and talking about this philosopher and that philosopher, I really liked how we were able to immediately go and talk about the territory, the things that these philosophers were referencing, and see how it was applicable to our everyday life. I thought the exciting thing about this project is not just the kind of reintegration on the other side of deconstruction, but also the fact that this philosophy could be accessible to regular people, that these distinctions are things that regular people could grasp easier without having to do a full study of philosophy history. And
Hegel
I
or something.
I think that we need something like that, especially in a time like this, like you're saying, where we have all these fractured worldviews, all these different language games, all these different ways of talking about things. We need some kind of an ability to understand the pieces in relation to each other, to craft some kind of meta theory or some kind of holistic perspective that honors all the different perspectives but uses discriminating wisdom to be able to organize them and understand them in relation to each other.
Mhm. You mentioned Jung. I wanted to say, in the case of Freud and Jung, what is the difference, just real quick while we're on it? So Jung had a more, well, he had analytic psychology and the other was psychodynamic.
Yeah, Freud was the first psychologist, maybe after Nietzsche, And yeah, he tended to think about some of these non-rational things as being childish, and the future of an illusion is what he called them. He was also very interested in like family dynamics and things like that. But he brought a lot of important ideas to the table. You know, that's where we get the idea of the ego and stuff like that. Jung was really interested in taking a lot of the things that Freud considered to be nonsense more seriously. Sometimes he would go a bit far with it, but in general, he had a more transrational perspective. He was able to say that there were true things about certain symbols and metaphors and dream interpretation and things like this in ways that Freud just wasn't really that interested in.
You kind of brushed it off, right?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. I had written to you that with new additions to philosophy, what is your project with, say, non-reductionist philosophy as a new addition? What is new there?
Yeah, non-reductionism is a reaction against integral theory. I was a teacher in that community for a little over a decade, and I started to, after a while, see a lot of the problems with it in ways that it's basically doing bad integration. That's more on the theory side. There was also some social problems in the community and stuff like that. Like it's more of a cult of personality than really like a philosophy group.
Mhm.
It's kind of like Ken Wilber is the final word and like how dare you question him kind of a thing. He doesn't really address any of his critics. He's never had any public debates. So it's really hard to make much progress in terms of refinement or upgrades within that community. And so it kind of created a situation where people who didn't agree would basically have to create new ways of talking about these things outside of integral. That's also why metamodernism exists. I'm friends with Daniel Gortz, one of the founders, one of the guys who writes as Hansi in the metamodern books. And his goal was to secularize and politicize, which is very similar to what non-reductionism is trying to do. But in some ways, they've kind of lost ground. They've lost the theory, and because they don't have a figure, they have like a fictional character. And metamodernism was already a thing that other people were talking about. And so there's a lot of disagreements within that community. It's hard to even get a clear answer as to what metamodernism actually means when you talk to those people. They also don't like stages of development and they have some allergies against that. So, in some ways, I think they've lost some of the theoretical ground that Integral was standing on. They tried to politicize and they were able to influence a political party in Denmark, I believe. And so, that's good. And they tried to secularize and stuff like that, but they weren't really able to fix a lot of the problems with like leadership and community structure and a lot of this kind of stuff. So I saw that too, I saw the problems in Integral. I saw the problems in metamodernism, their attempt to fix some of these problems. And I basically made a mental catalog of all of these problems and tried to solve them, as well as bring a lot of the upgrades that I was developing over the years, teaching and talking about theory. So I'm also with the idea of trying to secularize, although I would maybe more talk about it differently. I would say that I'm more interested in, when it comes to theory and stuff like that, making sure that the ideas are really well grounded. I mentioned before that Integral has some bad integration. Wilbur has a strong bias towards Eastern religious ideas. And so that kind of messes up the integration. We're trying to be fair and have overarching standards as it relates to the integration of all different worldviews. And he ends up breaking his rules in multiple ways to favor the worldviews that he likes. It becomes kind of a conflationary integration. And one of the things that I found as a theme within early integration, we could say that there's early sort of personal integration and then later more like a collective style of integration. In the more early personal integration, there's kind of a problem with people still favoring ideas that they like and like wanting to integrate in relation to those ideas. So you get different kind of versions of conflationism. Before that, postmodernists, they do like a buffet style pick and choose with all these incoherent ideas. But the more personal integration has this conflationary style where Wilbur will talk about the great traditions, and all those traditions happen to be all the idealistic traditions. And then he kind of
Right.
conflates them all into the idealistic tradition that he likes and be like, well, they all confirm this.
So like Advaita
But
Vedanta is something he really likes.
right, right. And it's like at the heart of the worldview. So it makes its way into all of the main elements and it kind of corrupts his view of the elements, I would say. And we can talk about that more.
Okay.
But I would say later stage, more collective integration is really concerned with wringing out personal bias as it relates to integration, because the projects at that higher level are not just personal level integration projects where it's like, I want to become more holistic as an individual. I want to have an integral business or do integral this or integral that. The concern starts to be more about how can we create new transformative systems that will serve the whole spiral, that will work for everyone at every level. And if you're really going to be able to create these new transformative systems, you can't bring your personal bias and then try to put that on everyone. It really has to be a fair, overarching integration that doesn't favor or bias any particular worldview or perspective.
Let me interject
Yeah.
here. So can you explain for us a integral theory, okay,
hmm
integralism, and then say get just a touch on metamodernism and then your theory of non-reductionism. People, I mean, I think people have heard these terms, but they haven't heard it, articulated clearly.
Like, what are they?
Yeah, just quickly. So with integral theory with Wilbur.
Integral theory is like the first attempt at like a postmodern reintegration on the other side of the deconstruction that postmodernists do. So
Right.
postmodernism kind of relativizes everything and creates a flatland.
Mhm.
And then the idea in integral is to realize that some ideas are better than others, and we start to honor natural growth hierarchy. We make a distinction between imposed dictator hierarchy, which is this kind of might makes right hierarchy, versus natural growth hierarchy, which has to do with maturity and things like this. And this is where the integration of developmental psychology and a lot of these kinds of things come in to justify and ground that understanding of development.
So we have quarks, and then we have atoms, and we have molecules. This will be like a natural hierarchy, right?
Right, that would be yeah, like a natural hierarchy in nature. Another way to think of it is there's such a thing as like a master musician and a beginner musician, such a
Right.
thing as like a teacher who's been studying something for years and a student, or something like a really mature adult and a baby, and all these different stages of development and maturity in between. We
So
make these distinctions all the time.
let's do a role play here, back and forth. If I say, David, you can't make any judgments, what's wrong with this statement?
That's a judgment in itself. It's
Exactly.
a performative self-contradiction. It's a type of hypocrisy. And then you end up judging me for judging, thinking that it's better not to think that ideas are better, these kinds of things.
Right. So then
Um,
my comeback would be, well, David, you just judged me. So, how can we have a conversation? Because I'm so enlightened.
well, part of also what we're doing when we make these judgments is we're talking about higher and higher levels of inclusion. So it's not about judging like a trying to put someone in a box to dismiss them. We want to take into account more and more perspectives so that way we can actually like love people and engage with them in a more skillful way. We understand that every person is on their own path, but we also understand the steps on that path. So we can help people walk along that path. Like the best way to actually love and serve people is to be able to tell the difference between a perspective that's healthy and vitalizing and a perspective that's harmful and hurtful.
Mhm. Okay, so yeah, right. So that was a great description of how integral basically took on postmodernism. Of course, scientific
hmm
epistemology did also with Alan Sokal with the hoax and all this kind of thing. Okay, now moving over into what we would call more healthy holism, which is what you're talking
Yeah,
about. Non-reductionism. Okay, say Rene Descartes,
yeah.
reductionist kind of thinking compared to, say, the modern integrative sciences, consciousness theory. Okay, now we're to non-reductionism. Can you take off from there?
Yeah. Well, non-reductionism is making further meta distinctions that even integral doesn't make. So, like, we want something like epistemic humility, so we want to be very careful with our claims. But Wilbur would say something like, we need to include all four quadrants, which are these different aspects of reality, right? Interiors and exteriors, individuals and collectives. This is like the shorthand way for how we start to begin to talk about philosophy. But we talk about something called quadratic primacy. or nested quadratic holons, which is an understanding about nesting and primacy. So it's not just all four quadrants all the way down and back, or all four quadrants nested inside of consciousness, which is what he thinks. We would say that different quadrants are primary as it relates to different projects. So, for example, like you mentioned, Rene Descartes. Well, he had this idea of building your ideas from the ground up, starting with nothing. I think that's a good project. I mean, he messed it up a little bit and brought in some of his religious ideas, backdoor Christian, sneaking Jesus in through the back door and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to epistemology, we have to start with our interiority. All we know is that I exist. And then we have to deal with the problem of other minds. And then we figure out that we exist together in a shared reality. And then we have methods to figure out how to know things about reality, ontology and cosmology. So when we discover things about ontology and cosmology, we find out that emergentism is true, that consciousness arises as an evolutionary process on a planet, in time, in the world. And so in that regard, consciousness is an emergent and reality is primary. So the primacy switches as it relates to different topics.
Mhm.
And one thing I think is really helpful that I haven't ever seen or heard anybody ever talk about as it relates to philosophy is this idea we have about the pyramid of philosophical primacy. You have to do the philosophical projects in the correct order to actually make them harmonize with each other. And when a person doesn't do them in the correct order, what they often will end up doing is favoring a particular philosophical project at the expense of other projects. People will, like Jordan Peterson or something like that, he'll start with what he thinks is goodness, and then he'll try to reduce truth to goodness.
Right.
People
Right. He's very
sometimes start
stuck
with,
right on that. He's very stuck
yeah,
right on that. Yeah, that's
yeah,
true.
people will start with beauty and try to think that what's good and what's true are subsets of beauty, and that gets them into all kinds of problems. People will start with a particular cosmology that they want to be true,
Mhm.
and then that gets them into all these different kinds of problems. Like the only way to really make all the different projects harmonize with each other is if you do the projects in the correct order, where we try to figure out what's true and we ground our ideas, and then we try to be good in relation to what's true. And then we try to beautify the ways in which we're good in relation to what's true.
Mhm.
So these ideas about primacy are things that integral theory doesn't talk about. They create this sort of flat issue.
Let's go into that for a moment, like the good, the true, and the beautiful that come from Plato talked about it, but it's been widely known. Take, for example, after the Iraq invasion of 2003, I think it was just maybe like a year after that or the same year, Michael Moore, the filmmaker, had a
Mhm.
documentary about the war. And then he had, made a protest at I guess it was the Academy Awards or whatever that is that they get. And Nicole Kidman had responded to him that, but we're artists, not politics. There's a
Mhm.
case where beauty is supposed to overcome ethics or humanity, right? So can you make a comment just on a real world example?
Yeah, I mean, I think that most people agree that what really makes art beautiful is that it holds a mirror up to reality. It holds a mirror up to personal experience, and it holds a mirror up to society, and it comments on it, and it exposes the pain and the suffering and the drama of life. And that's what makes it beautiful. So, yeah, I don't know how you can really make any kind of really deep or meaningful art without addressing those things.
Exactly. Okay, so we were talking about the good, the true, and the beautiful, and I had mentioned beauty, and there's a lot of conflation going on. So if I say I stick with only beauty, I'm way up there, and but not bringing that down to earth, and then there's no ethic, and all of this tries to get kind of tangled up with one particular position. In the case of postmodernism, there was a dangerous relativity there that we talked about. That if you're not allowed to make any judgments, and then you say you can't make any judgments, then you're already making a judgment. So then there has to be some kind of recognition or differentiation of certain things do have merit, right? Like
Yeah,
if I need a surgery, I don't go to a chef, I go to the surgeon. But if I
right.
need a pizza, I go to the chef, right? All right, so let's say going with science and philosophy, we mentioned Descartes. Can you take off from here, from where we were at? I asked you about metamodernism, so let's talk just a little bit about that, and then we can look at the critique also.
Okay, sure. So metamodernism was noticing a lot of the issues in the Wilberian community. From what I was told, he was seeing basically a lot of woo-woo in there, like a lot of new age stuff, a lot of spiritual stuff, and also this kind of feeling of self-importance and kind of like patting yourself on the back, like, yeah, we're so smart in Integral, and they would kind of just like talk in circles all the time. This
Metamodernism is a response to postmodernism, the same as integralism.
Yeah, that's true, but also a response to a lot of the problems that were happening in Integral,
So it
right?
has an ethics. So there's an ethic.
Yeah, to try to make it more secular and political, to make it less talking about spiritual things and how smart we are and talking in circles forever and more active and engaged in the world.
Yep, I got it.
They kind of took on this category as it relates to art. That's where the meta-modern distinction comes from. They were talking about modernism, then postmodernism, then meta-modernism, which was about this idea of a lot of art and movies and stuff like this was starting to get into this kind of like sarcasm and like always like being too cool for, like Deadpool style or whatever, like too cool to like ever be sincere. And a lot of the
Wow.
older movies and things like that, where they were more sincere and just in it, were considered to be cheesy, right? So, in the context of this development, this meta-modern type of art was considered to have like a sincere irony, like a kind of combination or a synthesis of the two that maintained the sincerity, but also understood the irony. And that's the term that they ended up using. But like I said, there were already other thinkers and people talking about that, using that term. And so, because there's a lot of different people in that space talking about it differently, what it means to be meta modern is not really grounded. It's not like in Integral where we have Wilbur. He's the authority, he's the one who said what it is, and he set up the systems and the methods and the maps, and we work within that. In this kind of context, there's all these different authors. And even the authors that were trying to rework the integral ideas and talk about them in this meta modern space, they did it under a pseudonym. And so it's not a real person. And so that was like their attempt to try to correct this, wanting to put themselves up as a position of authority. But there
Right.
needs to be some kind of an authority to ground the ideas. And so not
It's
having
kind of
that
like,
ended up being a problem.
yeah, I mean, societies do this. So like say Bitcoin, they have Satoshi Nakamoto, but it's a group of developers, right? They kind of just went off and they left the white paper. You have the prophets. It goes up to the mountain, brings the Ten Commandments back. So, okay, I can understand them trying to get out of that cult of personality, which is the criticism you have of the others,
Yeah.
vanity project, elitism, and all that. So, okay, I got it. In the case of non-reductionism, are you trying to synthesize or are you creating a new analytical process? I mean, what is the
Well, as
direction
it
there?
as it relates to that particular problem, the way that I'm trying to solve it is basically to set up a process of integration. So I, for right now, am the authority on what it is. I'm saying what it is. The first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to set up a course that teaches people the basics of the theory, and it's an accreditation course. So that way there starts to be some kind of a hierarchy within the community, different circles of integration that go deeper and deeper. So if you take the first level course, then you're qualified to talk about it from a position of knowing what it is. You can go and teach about it, you can go and do meetups about it. And then this kind of separates the first level of hierarchy between people who are just coming into the community and people who like know what they're talking about what it is. Because it's really important to maintain the integrity. But there will be further levels of integration still. Eventually, it'll be a case where I'm not just the leader, but I'll be a leader. And there will be processes through which we can process tensions and upgrade the maps together. Even still, a lot of the upgrades that non-reductionism includes are coming out of my interactions with my community over the years in talking about these ideas, where I have been open to them suggesting ideas and upgrades and a lot of these things. And like, for example, one of the processes in our flow chart of epistemology towards the end is something called tetravalidation. This was a suggestion by someone in my group, which is basically like we're not just looking in the correct quadrant for data, not just looking in the right spot to find the data about the thing that we're looking at. But then after that, we're checking in the other quadrants to see if
Right.
the data in those quadrants confirms those ideas. Like a simple way to talk about it is you're wondering how your wife is doing, and you go, "Babe, are you okay?" And she goes, "I'm fine." It's like, okay,
Okay,
well,
so empirically, you hear tone and you hear words, right?
right. You got her phenomenological report. She is the expert on her interiority. But the
Right.
way that she said it, like her body language, her tone, our history together, all these other things are kind of telling me that maybe she's not fine, you know? So that would be one example of
She's
that.
not going to like you when she sees this video.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a classic example that could be for people, male or female, in all relationships. This kind of happens
Right.
sometimes.
That's right. We don't want our wife to see our philosophy, David, so we don't let them look at this.
I
Okay,
said, I said your wife. I said your
you said
wife.
my wife. Yeah, like when your wife says this,
Like
right?
when your wife says she's fine.
I got you. I got you. So there's interiority and there's exteriority. Let me set up just a quick example. So say like in Zen, you do the breath with the teacher, the teacher listens to your breath, and then the teacher will ask you questions like koans. All right, so there's a testing going on. In scientific epistemology, when I went to study, and when we go to study, we have to create an experiment that's new. Then we have to run the experiment, and then we write about it, and it has to be repeated. Okay, we have two different epistemologies going on here, right?
Right.
Okay, so we have empirical, and then we have just inner knowledge. And people call this scientific or yogic, but anyway, modern science is here, and then we have inner experience here.
Right.
Okay, so now these are different sides of your diagram. You know, and I've given these two examples. Can you walk us through the integration of this?
Yeah. So integral theory has something that it calls integral methodological pluralism, but non-reductionism has something that it calls 4P4Z. They're similar but different. I probably shouldn't try to teach them both at once, but basically we do quadrants within quadrants. They're looking at insides and outsides in each quadrant, and we're looking at four prime epistemic methodologies as it relates to each quadrant. So the prime epistemic methodologies are phenomenology in the upper left, the scientific method in the upper right. Like these are things that we just talked about, a process for interiority and a process for exterior science. But on the collective side, there's hermeneutics having to do with meaning. And this relates more to like sociology. So, like, for example, if we're going to ask what something means, well, that's not a fact in the world that you can measure. And it's not just my opinion. We have to like go look it up in the dictionary and see what the agreement about that is, right? So, those are the interior systems, like my feelings in the upper left, individual interior, and shared agreement in the lower left, or like the collective interior. Earlier, we were talking about how people say, "Oh, it's all relative." Well, relative doesn't mean just whatever. It means like related to. Like the example that you gave. If I want to make some food, I should go to a cook. If my car breaks, I should go to the mechanic. It's like these topics are related to these fields. And
Mhm.
then in the lower right, as it relates to philosophy and some other systems type of approach, we have systems theory. And so these are the different prime epistemic methodologies. There are certain disciplines, like, for example, neuroscience does a combination of different methodologies. It correlates interior phenomenological reports about personal experience to measurements of equipment and like brain states and things like that. These little pill looking things are what we call contingent ontological factors. So this is a huge improvement because before in integral theory, they would have this problem where they would look at something like, let's say, a rock or an album or something like that, and they want to take into account all these different methods to try to get information about it. But because a rock or an album doesn't have any interiority, they would either end up projecting interiority into it and say it's like it feels like this, or they would describe their own interiority as it relates to the thing. Like, I feel like
Right.
this about this album. So the good thing about this is that it helps us to say, okay, well, these are the four quadrants of the person looking, not just the interior quadrants of how I feel, but how I feel, like, let's say, as a white man from this country in this culture with these things, right? And
Mhm.
these are the different relevant aspects of the thing I'm looking at, and this is the context in which the looking is taking place. So this is a huge improvement. It fixes a lot of the problems with the integral epistemology, and I think it becomes way more helpful as it relates to more serious uses of epistemology, like in science and in medicine, probably even in court or investigations or something like that. Knowing all the factors at play and knowing how to get all the data and weigh them in relation to each other is really important.
I've taken some notes here because it's like I'm in one, actually, I wanted to say David has a class on this, and I'm going to put that in the summary. I, I was just looking through this, trying to relate this to the Wilbur's, what he calls the AQUAL map, which is a map of samsara. So basically, what we could say, we're looking at a map of samsara, right? We're trying to get some kind of orientation within this kind of field of sense and perception.
That could be a way of framing it. It's an idealistic frame to say that the world is samsara. And there could be something metaphorically true about that. I would say this is a map of the different aspects of reality. This is a map of ontology, or what ontology means is what is it? The different categories of types of things, subjective, objective, intersubjective, and interobjective, and different epistemologies or ways of knowing about those different aspects of reality. So, like different ways of knowing about the different aspects of reality that exists.
Okay, got it. Right.
Hmm.
Now, Sandra Mitchell, the philosopher of science and emergentism, she would argue that it seems to be that we're gaining some knowledge, right? Science seems to work. We adjust, say, rockets, the first rockets blow up, then you start making adjustments. Same thing with surgery, same thing with medicine.
Hmm.
And at the same time, we're finding how much more we don't know, right?
Right.
Okay, so this is happening. On the other hand, we can explain certain aspects from Newtonian mechanics. Newtonian mechanics still works. Say it worked to say build my house.
Yeah.
We trusted. Most people just go into buildings and don't even think about it, right? Or they fly on an airplane. Okay, now, however, Mach and Einstein coming up into quantum physics, we find out that that stuff doesn't hold up within certain description levels.
Right.
Okay, where it
Different
works in
levels of
one level and
reality.
it doesn't. Exactly.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through this part now? So we've got your map. Now we're looking at different explanations. Do we have knowledge? What are we looking at?
Yeah. So we definitely want to have epistemic humility. There's these two or three different things that are in play here. So one of them is wanting to appreciate all worldviews, wanting to value all language games. Like earlier you mentioned samsara, right? So there's a way in which I think those symbols cash out in relation to reality. So it depends on what you mean by it, right? There's ways in which it's poetically true. If you're saying other things
Right,
about it, there might be ways in which it might not be literally true.
right.
So we want to honor the truth that's in all worldviews, and we want to have a fair way of looking at all those things. But we want to have epistemic humility. We don't want to overstep our bounds. We don't want to make claims about things beyond our ability to actually know. So we want to take a humble perspective. But on the other hand, we
Mhm.
also want to have discriminating wisdom. We want to be able to say that we do know certain things, that there are proven conclusions, that certain things are known. You know what I mean? So this is why it's important to ground our knowledge with good epistemology, so that way when we do make claims about things, that we can say how we know those claims are true. On
Right.
my
So we want to have authority, but not authoritarianism, right? So
right,
we have experts, right?
right,
We want to have experts. They are authorities. They gain certification in whatever it is that they're doing.
yeah,
Okay, so we've got that. We developed the fact that we have some knowledge and we have authorities that can hold that knowledge.
hmm,
But we also want to be particularly humble. We don't want authoritarian systems, right? And of course, we
right,
want this distributed. We want people to have access to this knowledge from the experts.
right,
Okay, so moving on into what we know, say in the case of describing reality, and we're speaking from different levels.
right,
Okay, so I spoke about like to make a house or for the surgeon to make an incision. These are mechanical defined situations, empirically validated. Right now, when we start to describe mental states, so we're moving into the upper left quadrant, right?
well, maybe
When
the
we
way
want
to
to describe,
go would be to say that there are different lines within each one of these quadrants. Like that's kind of what you're saying. There's like people who have
okay, yes,
skills
yes,
as it relates to science, sociology, philosophy, and also personal development. So, like, our ideas about stages are basically done by doing a meta-analysis of these different lines and talking about universals across lines, right? So that's the importance of developmental psychology and being able to ground these stages of development in science about lines. And basically, what these developmental psychologists do is they ask people the same questions over the course of like years, and they get predictable answers. They not only ask them the question, but they ask them, why is that your answer? And
Mhm.
what this reveals is that as people mature, not only do they start to give more and more predictable answers, but they start to include more factors in their reasoning
Right,
as it comes
right.
to relating to these answers. And I think in general, people are pretty familiar with the idea of the culture wars. We've mentioned it a bit here, you know. Traditional people are putting pressure on impulsive, egoic people to have self-control and to live for a higher purpose. Modern, rational people are putting pressure on traditional people to ground their ideas in science and logic. Postmodern people are putting pressure on modern people to understand that even their words and names and ways of creating categories are man-made, and there might be power games or like built-in assumptions in those ways of talking about things that they don't realize that objective truth isn't absolute truth, that it's still a form of relative truth. And then what we're talking about in terms of postmodern integration, these integrative stages are putting pressure on postmodernism to be like, yes, all of these truths are relative man-made truths, but some are more true than others. Some include more factors than
Exactly.
others. Some extend more care than others.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I was getting at. So what Sandra Mitchell would say is that we have knowledge and we can see differentiations in the knowledge. The chef isn't as good at surgery as the surgeon.
Right?
And also some people behave better than others,
Yeah,
right? There's not like a flattened out kind of morality, you
right.
know. So when I mentioned Newton and then up to Mach and Einstein, we can speak at the level of, say, mechanics. Like take the Petronas Towers in Malaysia. One side was built by Japan, the other side was built by South Korea. Same towers on both sides, they're twin towers, same mathematics, same physics, and all of that, right? Okay, what I'm trying to do here is get around most postmodernism. I'm going to put that to rest. Because if you didn't have some kind of mechanics going on, then the towers wouldn't go up. Let's say like the Japanese are using 1, 3, 4, 5, and the Koreans are using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're not going to get any kind of engineering with that. Okay. So, but I'm trying to press you a little bit on the deeper aspects. I guess it would be like saying going deeper than say Maslow or Rogers in psychology and going deeper than say Wilbur or Aurobindo, because I think you've got it. When I've looked at your stuff, I think you've got something going there. And so that's why I'm asking you to describe at different levels, going into say consciousness, the upper left quadrant, for example,
Yeah,
we can see developmental stages, kind of like a linearity,
yeah,
and we can see something there too,
right.
right? For example, a baby doesn't just come out of the womb speaking about differential equations
True.
or universal love, just not there, right?
Yeah.
And it takes a certain amount of time before these structures come about, but also there's an element there that's not developmental. So can you talk a little bit about this? I think Wilbur has like some kind of steps model and then he has colors but I don't know exactly what that is. How do you describe this phenomenon?
That sounds like something like the Wilbur-Combs matrix that you're describing, which is that states are interpreted from different stages. Like they say, states are free and stages are earned. In other words, anybody at any stage of development can get into any state, a state of consciousness, waking dream, deep sleep. You know, there are other states that probably babies can't get into, you know, like trained meditative states or flow states or something like that. But in general, the idea is that
Right.
everybody can get into these states, but they'll always interpret those states from whatever stage of development that they're at. They only have their worldview to be able to talk about and make sense of their experience. And so if you give people a similar kind of experience, they'll talk about it in terms that they understand. But I also take
So,
a
so
little
if,
bit different
yeah, go ahead.
perspective on lines too. We talked about developmental psychology lines. But I think there might be more nuance in relation to lines that still needs to be teased out. For example, Howard Gardner talked about multiple intelligences, right? And basically, what he was saying when he was talking about these multiple intelligences is he was responding to people who were basically trying to reduce intelligence to IQ. And he was being like, there's other kinds of intelligence. There's interpersonal intelligence, there's kinesthetic intelligence, linguistic
Music.
intelligence, all, yeah, musical intelligence, all these kinds of things. And they're valuable too. So, what I think he's actually talking about are more like these certain biological capacities, things that might be natural to us, that maybe aren't as natural or easy for other people, right? And then those different natural capacities can be applied to different lines. And then there are different lessons as it relates to those lines at different stages. Like one way I could talk about it is, let's say you're this person who has a really high general stage of development and you want to get into music. Well, you might come at music and you might be like, well, I want to make music that's like the kind of music that's like this high level art that I really value. Like, I want to make this postmodern or this postmodern integrative art, like maybe like even like surrealism or do something like that. It's like, okay, you might approach art with that kind of a desire to make that kind of an art. But the way that you're probably going to try to approach, like, let's say it's music or something like that, is in the light of strengths that you already have, these kind of natural capacities. Maybe you have a linguistic intelligence and you're like, okay, I want to do songwriting. I want to like write really clever lyrics and things like that. Maybe you're better at like wanting to express yourself. And so it's more about like wanting to share your feelings, or maybe there's more like an interpersonal communication that you want to do. Or maybe you have like a type of kinesthetic intelligence and you want to really like approach music with that kind of a thing first, right? So music is a line, there's musical intelligence, but there's all these different ways to approach it. And even if you want to be making music that's way up here, you still have to develop your musical line up through different stages, and there's different lessons as it relates to different stages. Like, for example, at like the early stages of development, maybe you need to work on self-expression and creativity, like your ability to even like emote through your instrument. And then maybe at Blue, there's a kind of like practicing and repeating of other people's work that you should probably do to like
Mm.
learn how music is. There are some people who are really good at, like, let's say playing piano or something like that. They can read music and play the songs, or they've learned and memorized songs, but maybe they play it in a really mechanical kind of way. Like they're not putting feeling into it, right? And then if you ask them to improvise, they can't do it. They don't know how. So like
Right.
beyond just practicing the thing, there's learning about theory, learning music theory and why this stuff works, and practicing scales and stuff like that. And beyond that, there's improvisation and flow and learning how to speak the language of music through your instrument or through your thing. And then beyond that, there's like breaking the rules and like um, integration of different
Yeah.
styles and stuff like that.
What you're describing actually reminds me of the story of, say, like Beethoven and Mozart. And with Beethoven, you have this really deep, heavy, however they play. But anyway, it's someone who's an expert in that could tell you. Then you have Mozart that's really light and airy and and so forth. Both of those are great music, right?
Sure.
But there's a foundation that they have to have. It's interesting that you were saying that this improvisation, because when Beethoven's father took him to Salzburg to talk to Mozart, Mozart was older than Beethoven. And the story goes that when Beethoven, of course, played for Mozart what he had ready to go, right? And Mozart said, that's good. And then Beethoven said, well, give me a theme, give me something. And so Mozart gave him a theme. Beethoven played it, and Mozart responded, he's going to change the world. Okay, so now we're up here at the level of creativity that you're talking about, which is tremendous, wonderful, right?
Right. Yeah, basically, this idea is that if you want to be really good at something, you have to learn the basics first. And if you want to really be a post-conventional artist, you need to probably
Mhm.
learn the conventions first. Otherwise, you're a pre-conventional artist. You're just
Right.
feeling at a thing really hard. Like, this is like a problem that you see maybe on like college radio, right? Is that you have these people who don't know about these different distinctions, and so they might confuse some messy pre-conventional art with some creative outside the box post-conventional art, and because they're both non-conventional, they get put together. This happens a lot too with like modern art, which is actually postmodern art. You have someone like Jackson Pollock who's like throwing paint And then you have someone like you mentioned earlier, Picasso and Cubism, and they get put in the same category when maybe that's
Right.
not exactly appropriate. Like, can Pollock do anything representational? Does he know any of the
Well,
basics of
I
art?
I think a good response here is Andy Warhol. So he
There you
just
go.
takes a bunch of Campbell soup and he just says it's all surface.
Right.
Mhm.
So if you want to be a good artist and you want to really develop yourself, you might think about how you relate to art in terms of like what are your fundamental capacities, what are your natural strengths, and how might that relate to art? And then what are the different lessons from the different stages as it relates to that line that you could work on to improve yourself? Maybe you need to learn more
Exactly.
theory. Maybe you need to work on expressing yourself more through the art. Like maybe you need to get more in touch with the feelings of the art and putting that in so it's not so robotic. And then maybe once you learn some of that stuff, then you can learn to improvise or break the rules a little bit, go outside the box. But yeah, you're probably not going to just be able to, because I'm mentally up at this level, immediately then pick up art and be able to make art at that level. Probably going to have to go back down and work your way up. So different lines grow through stages differently. Some lines run ahead, some lines run behind. And in terms of the main lines of development, the cognitive line runs ahead, usually. We say cognitive development is necessary but not sufficient for moral development because you have to be able to understand something and value it to be able to care about it and act good for it, right? So cognitive
Mhm.
line runs ahead. The values line is kind of more in the middle, and then the moral line will run behind. And that's why generally we use spiral dynamics as the main way of talking about stages, because usually the values line, which is what spiral dynamics is talking about, is more representational of our general altitude. But it's important to say that people are not at stages. We transcend and include stages as we grow. Like I was talking about with this art. It's not like, oh, you're making art at this level. Well, you're able to make art at this level because of all the lessons you've learned at these previous levels, and you've included them in your ability to do art at this level. So it's like that with stages in general. There's important values and lessons that need to be integrated at every stage of human development. I do a thing called spiral wizard training. It starts out basically just going through the stages and talking about what the values are at all those stages to kind of help the person to understand how those things can and should be included in them, how they themselves should value the lessons at each one of the stages. And then we go further into basically like arguing through the stages where I show them how if you push deep enough into every stage, you will end up in the next stage. And then I get them to argue with me, like, okay, I'm blue, move me to orange, something like that. I'm a traditional conformist, I'm a religious person, help me to get to orange. What are the axioms that you would use to move me? And then I get them to argue me up through the spiral.
Why don't we do that right now so that people can hear it? So
Okay.
I'll make the statement. Thor is the be all end all God of the universe. And right now, the thunder outside is Thor's hammer. And actually, recently, the economic collapse is because Thor is working through the president of the United States. Okay, so I really believe that. And this is how I'm going to act in my
Right.
life. Can
Well, that's
you help
blue,
me?
traditional conformist.
Okay.
The way that I would argue with you is I would want to appeal to the important values of blue, which would be by talking about the importance of absolute truth and a greater good. If you believe in Thor, I would ask you something like, how do we know about Thor?
Right. I think we start off with this need for an absolute truth, right? That seems to be a fairly common ground that people
Yeah,
have. Okay. And then someone who's fixated on having to put a being there, like say Thor. Okay. So now we have Thor. And well, I just have faith in Thor, is
have
the usual comment.
you just have faith in Thor. Well, this is a move that not all traditional people will do. In particular, this is a move that often Christians will do. is
Right, right,
is retreat into faith. Like for example, in Islam, they understand that God gave us a brain and that we should use it and things should make sense, you know?
right. More
So
rational.
in general, I think this is true if you're talking to a religious person. Like the first thing that you have to talk about with them is if they care about what's true, right? So it's like, okay, Thor believer guy, let me ask you this. If you had a friend and you were out somewhere and you saw his wife and she was with another man and you're like, oh, what's happening here? And then you see them kiss and you're like, oh, and you get your phone out and you take a picture of it. right? And then you go to your friend and you're like, okay, I have a hard thing to tell you, my friend. You're not going to want to hear this, but I saw your wife with another man and I took a picture. Like I saw them coming out of a hotel and hugging and kissing and stuff. How would you feel if your friend was like, nothing you will ever tell me or show me will make me believe that that is true? Will you,
Yeah, this is right, because I'm only operating with my inner knowledge. I don't care what you're saying, right?
will you continue to respect this man and think that when hard times come and when there's important hard truths to deal with, that he'll be capable and ready to deal with them? Or is he just going to go la 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 la, you know? Like, how are you going to continue to
Mm.
go and have dinner with this man and his wife when you know about this? So,
Right. So you have to deny empirical reality to maintain the position that I have.
right. So I would start there. I would be like, do you care about truth, what it really is? And are you willing to change your mind if proof could be offered? And I'm not saying necessarily as of yet that I have proof to offer, but would you even be willing to change your mind? Is there anything that could change your mind? And do you really care about what's actually true? And I think most people would say, most religious people even would say, that they really do care about what's actually true. So that would be a good
Mm.
place to start.
Yeah, I think that you start with the common needs, the need for absolute truth, the need for food, the need for clean air. Unless somebody is just going to be totally so far gone that they're going to say they don't care about clean air because Thor's going to take care of it or something, which there are people in the government that say this stuff.
Right. I mean, if their God is true, I want to believe it. I want to believe in true things. I want to align myself with truth. Shouldn't you expect me to want to align with what's true and good? If your God is real, shouldn't I want to also believe in it so I can be good? So we have to work together
Yeah,
to
I
figure out
think that
what's true, right? So that's an axiom to build on. We can move from there. And then basically, it won't be long from there before I get them to admit some version of agnosticism, where God is beyond their ability to fathom with their little human perspective.
I call that radical openness.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I
Try
like
to understand
about
what we can.
Islam is that they won't picture God. They'll say God's not a person. They don't want to personify God. God doesn't have an eye, God doesn't have a hand, and you can't make a picture of him. Out of all the traditions, in my opinion, actually Islam might be the best on this topic. They're like the closest to something like an agnostic position. Much easier to move
Mhm.
a person in Islam towards this kind of rational perspective than it would be to move a Christian who retreats into faith.
If you have someone that retreats into what they're calling faith, which actually really isn't faith, it's more like just total incoherence,
Yeah. Willful
that
ignorance.
then if they retreat back into that, then what's going to happen is they're probably going to say that we're the God's only chosen ones or whatever. I think that agnosticism helps. So Bertrand Russell responded to these kind of questions like, well, we're atheistic about Zeus and Hera and Nike and Thor and the 5,000 other gods, but only one, the one that we want, is the right one. This is the one that we grew up with, or something like that. So
Right.
I think there might be some questions there,
So atheists
and I
just
think that's a
go
way to
one more
get.
God further.
Yeah, so atheism wouldn't hold up either because you would have to be able to have, seems like to me, extraordinary knowledge that doesn't seem to me that human beings have or could have.
Well, it depends on how
So,
you define atheism, because if it's about a belief in a personal God, then I think it might make sense to say that. And I think atheism is more about belief than it is about epistemology, right? So, like, there are a lot of atheists who will be like, if you ask me if I believe in a personal God, I'll tell you I don't believe in a personal God. If you ask me if I know about the absolute truth of the universe, I'll say I don't know, right? So you can be hard
right.
agnostic and atheist. They're kind of talking about different things, I would say.
Augustine talks about it's ineffable and these kinds of things. I think that ineffability, I think radical openness. In Zen, they say stay with, don't know mind. Doesn't mean we don't know anything. It's just stay with, don't know mind. I put it in more like a non-negative terminology and just call it radical openness.
Yeah,
There's an openness there.
that there's always more to learn, something like that.
Yeah, my guess is that we can't know, and actually we don't have very much knowledge. That's my guess, even though we can do what
Well,
seems to be miracles.
this is where it's good to have different categories of truth, right? Because we're in particular right now when we're saying that it can't be known, we're talking about absolute truth. But when it comes
Right.
to certain objective facts, well, we can know some of that kind of stuff. And when it comes to like our own subjective feelings, well, we have direct experience to that. So like if I'm feeling sad, I can be pretty sure that I'm feeling sad and I'm pretty certain about that. So having these different
Right.
categories and knowing how well we can and can't know about them and what the limits of our knowledge are is really helpful. You know, most people do that. They kind of talk about truth as if it's only one thing when there's these different types of truth and different ways of knowing things about the different types of truth. If you start applying one kind of idea about how we can know all truth based on your experience with one kind of truth, then you start to get into problems, right? We can't
Right.
act like we don't know anything because that would be a problem. We would be not denying things that we know. We can't act like it's just all objective. And if we don't have objective truth, then we don't know anything because we do know subjective feelings. We can know that. We have,
Mhm.
it's just that these are certain domains that can't overstep each other. Like, I feel sad. Well, I can say I feel sad with certainty, but then if I try to say I feel sad and so I know things about reality, well, that's overstepping. And going back to your wife, she seems upset. Her mood is bad. She says she's fine. I mean, maybe I can doubt whether or not she's fine based on
Right. Right.
her
Right.
thing, but I can't know. Only she knows whether she's really fine, you know?
Yeah, these are really interesting things. I mean, it reminds me of, like, say, a veterinarian. A veterinarian has to be pretty smart because has to deal with different animals and they can't talk,
Right.
right? They can moan and so forth. Let's go to ethics because you and I talk about this a lot. There's problems within Integral that you've talked about.
Yeah.
In the past, we've talked about in private large scale turmoil. I've got here critique of gains and positives, losses, negatives, systemic breakdown. So maybe some comments there. And then theory and social production. What effects could we expect from application of non-reductionist holistic thinking, which is something that I actually agree with. I write about it too.
Yeah.
Let's go with, do you want to go with the big picture first? Do you want to talk about, like, I mean, there's large scale turmoil right now.
Yeah.
There, the biosphere, Ukraine, Gaza, the US, and on and on. Do you want to give some of your personal ideas on ethics and then put it into, say,
Sure.
this type of thought?
Yeah. Well,
Okay,
one
go
thing
ahead.
that we can say, like, as just kind of a baseline, is that in general, part of this next level understanding of development, I think, requires some kind of commitment and responsibility to engage in personal and cultural development. We have to figure out what's the best use of our time and energy and effort. And so we got to pick our battles wisely and do that. But in terms of what's going on in the world right now, things are crazy. And the current worldviews don't have solutions to these problems. Capitalism can't solve
Yeah.
capitalism. Postmodernists don't have any solutions because they don't judge, you know? So, I mean, they do judge. Let's be real.
It's
They do
it's
judge.
about the amoral kind of, like Foucault's amoral kind of commentary, which is totally crazy. But anyway, yes, I agree.
Yeah,
The institutions that we have, the philosophies that we have aren't going to do it right now.
right.
We have to have some kind of synthesis, I think some kind of integration.
Yeah, this kind of worldview is incredibly necessary. And that's also why it's really important to have the good epistemic grounding. Because if we're going to be able to speak with authority and present ourselves as doing fair integration, we really have to do fair integration. Otherwise, people are going to immediately be like, you're biased. You're favoring this worldview and not taking into account these other ones. So it's super important that we actually do have fair integration, fair overarching standards to integration, and that we skillfully engage, that we do something about it, that we meet the moment in a way that's appropriate to create a better world together. So, part of what, like I said before, that I'm trying to do with non-reductionism is to build an internal ladder to be able to establish it as a worldview, to integrate people into it so that way they can speak with authority in the context and apply it to their life and apply it to their work and apply it to these things. But further beyond that, the point of having some of this stuff is to create a community and to harness this community and these ideas into a movement that will change the world. Not just make hacks into
Right,
this or hacks into that, like, conscious capitalism and conscious business, like, oh, I'm going to be a conscious consumer and that, or have a conscious business. It's like that's not going to fix things. One conscious business or one conscious
right.
consumer is not good enough. We need to learn how to live together differently. We need to have better decision-making processes. And that, again, that comes back to these basic things of like good epistemology. And if we can't create a philosophical system where we can create good upgrades based on good information, even in the context of a philosophy, then how could we ever hope to have good decision making on a grand scale about how we can live together? Getting these things right, being able to actually do these things in a healthy and skillful way is the foundation for how we can create a better world together. If you don't have a fair decision-making process, if you don't have a way to ground your ideas and actually figure out what's actually good and true, you're going to end up in problems. And so this is why these ideas are so important. Of course, they're super important for individuals and their life and their things. But ultimately, I think we both realize that probably the greatest wasted resource is human potential. If we could create a society that invests in human potential and helps everyone to realize their highest potential, that's going to create a situation where everyone can bring their biggest contribution. The fact that we have a society right now that says, oh, you person that's just born, you're poor, so you're worth less than these other people, so you deserve less resources. Like this person could be the next Einstein, but we'll never know because we don't invest in them. That is stupid.
There have been people found, say, in a village in Africa or India that could learn to do mathematics much better than me anyway,
Yeah,
maybe much better than you too.
for sure.
Let me make an ethical statement that you might hear someone say, well, philosopher David, I do my yoga, I take 7-minute showers, I don't eat a lot of meat, I'm doing my part.
Yeah, good.
How do you respond?
All we can really ask anyone to do is their best, but we can also try to do better and better. There's always room for improvement, and currently the system is sort of set up in a way where no amount of any individual by themselves doing these kinds of things is going to fix the fundamental problems. So we need to create a new system that makes the old system obsolete, as Buckminster Fuller said. And, we have plans for how to do that. But at the end of the day, whether there's some kind of a revolution or a way to transition or a collapse or something like that, the hard problem on the other side of that is figuring out decision-making processes and resource management and those kinds of things, figuring out how to do it
Right.
better. Anybody can be like, let's have a revolution, you know, but if you don't know how you would do it better on the other side, then what are you revolutioning to? You're probably just going back to something that you thought was more pure before, but that's not going to cut
Right.
it.
Yeah, right. What's going to happen is you're going to end up tearing down a lot of things, and you have warlords rise up, and then you're going to have decades of that kind of thing
Right.
before maybe something can be done.
Yeah, we want
Uh,
breakthrough, not breakdown. So that means we need to figure out how to
exactly.
transition
Yeah.
onto a system that's actually better, that's actually more healthy. And, we have these kinds of different themes in political philosophy, the social and agentic themes, and they both go to their own different extremes. So, usually in the more individualistic or agentic themes, there's a big emphasis put on individual responsibility, which is good. We want individuals to be responsible. But like we already said, individuals being responsible is not enough. There's still community issues and things that are shared problems and things like that. And we need systems to deal with that. The communal systems have a problem too, where they tend to flatten everything, like we were saying before. Like they want to destroy all hierarchy, including natural growth hierarchy. We do, in general, want to move to the middle and include both. We want to be able to make opportunities for everybody and give everybody a chance to bring their highest contribution, but we also still want responsibility, and there still need to be systems in place to incentivize bringing more. So I would say we need something like collective individualism. Now, every form of synthesis will probably end up nesting one of the things inside of the other things, right? I think, especially in the West, we've gone so extreme towards the individual side that we probably need to kind of bend it back and get more in touch with some of the social themes and the communal themes. This poet I really like, Saul
Right.
Williams, he uses this analogy where he says, if you have a piece of paper or cardboard or something and it's bent to one side, the way to get it to stand back straight again is you have to bend it back towards the other side. So that way it kind of like straightens out, right?
I like Saul Williams.
Yeah,
He's
Saul
good.
Williams is awesome. If you guys don't know who Saul Williams is, go check out Saul Williams.
I want to recommend people go listen to him when he reads off of the paper. It's about a 15-year-old video, but he's reading off of a paper and he goes on and on.
We do hereby declare reality unkept by the changing standards of dialogue. Now is the time to self-actualize. Studies show that when a given norm is changed in the face of the unchanging, the remaining contradictions will parallel the truth.
He does hip hop, but he also does spoken word, this amazing poetry. So ultimately, I don't necessarily really think that it matters what the nesting is as it relates to this synthesis. But what really matters is that we move to the middle economically. You can't have these extreme outliers of super, super rich people and super, super poor people. There could be different ways of achieving a more balanced system. It could be that the communal is nested in the individualistic, or the individualistic is nested in the communal. But either way, it has to be done in a way that achieves balance. And there's different places in the world, different cultures and stuff like that. And so different cultures could have their own different styles and solutions to achieve these things. But definitely, we need something like a collective individualism, basically moving the hierarchy from the economic sphere to the social sphere. A more needs-based economic system in general that doesn't think about investments as handouts. We don't think about things like that with our kids. We're not just like, hey, fight for it, kid. We understand that they're developing and that, like, if we want the best out of them, we need to invest in them. So we need to do that with people in general, is invest in them to get the highest potential out of them.
The Cambridge economist and Korean economist, Ha-Joon Chang, talks about this. It's this book called Kicking Away the Ladder. They're kicking away the ladder from development, right? And then they're
Yeah,
investing in handing money out for this kind of plutocracy. He says, for my child, I don't just tell him just to go out and, hunt for food or something. There has to be a developmental process. There has to be basic things in place. I mean, clean air, for example. I mean, you can't argue with something like clean air.
right.
And that's not an individual handout, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and even if there's always going to be lazy people who will do less, let's say, the best way to
there always has
potentially,
been.
yeah, and there always will be. The best way to ever potentially get anything out of them is to make sure that their basic needs are met. People want to do projects. So
Right.
it's just a natural thing. Like
But
if we're not worrying about how we're going to survive, we're going to take that extra time and energy and put it towards something.
it's not that people are necessarily lazy. The system creates a pushback from people because they're not getting their basic needs met. They can't have families. One of the big things today is that people aren't having children. There's a
Yeah,
reason why people aren't having children, because you have to have a runway of 15, 16 years that you can see that you can provide, right?
right?
As you said, there's always been lazy people, but when you read about, say, like early cultures, like Stone Age economics and this kind of thing, even in those cultures, yeah, there were some people lazy, and you can see they complained about them, but everybody had what they needed, and actually people would contribute. As you say, I think that inherently human beings want to do projects. We can call it
Yeah,
work, you can call it whatever, but the issue is that we need to have inclusion at a basic fundamental level.
yeah.
That's correct.
And in terms of incentives, I mean, we can still have other ways of doing incentives, but social pressure and respect is a type of currency. Like if you're a lazy person who does nothing, good luck getting a girlfriend. If
Right.
if
That's an
you're
incentive.
Yeah, that's an incentive. If you're a person who sacrifices for his community and goes out and fixes a technical problem in an emergency, watch the community throw you a celebration and give you tons of respect.
Right.
Why would anybody want to be a doctor? Well, they would want to be a doctor because they care about helping people, because there's still going to be social rewards for being a person who puts in this work and who is the savior of the community by doing this important work.
Yeah, the
That's
same thing with
real.
a warrior, a doctor. I think we get that, but people actually don't get it, right? Because you get into this kind of warlike society, everybody has to compete, every interaction's transactional. Let me add some things here. Okay, so one is, say, like in ethics, we're talking about like in actual laws. The first duty is to not harm, to not participate in harm. So,
Yeah.
I would criticize the death camps going on. I wouldn't want to participate in, say, I studied in nanotechnology. I taught in biology. I refuse to work on weapons. Young people can do that. The second duty is intermediate duties, where we make amends, we make reparations for harms done. And the third duty, which is the weakest duty, is volunteering. So the system actually has all of this backwards, right? The next statement I wanted to make is about the self. How about in Buddhism that they say that the individual self is fine, individual liberty, privacy, all of this, but the problem is fragmentation. So how about the relational self? And you see this in Buddhism because it developed in the forests. You see this in the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, actually. So I wanted to add those in. And then finally, the ecological component, which is something we haven't mentioned, which we both
Yeah.
share. So how about talking a little bit more about this, and then we'll close on some things that people can do.
Yeah. Well, back in the day, it was a lot more difficult, I would say, for people to potentially realize their interconnectedness with nature and the world around them. Today, I mean, science basically proves it. It's a fact. The idea of, like you mentioned earlier, holons, this idea of there's really no individuals anywhere, that everything has subparts and is part of a larger whole itself. So there's these different forces from above and below. Even in psychology, we talk about nature and nurture, right? So, yeah, we are deeply interconnected. We're not just these individuals, and society, especially Western society, has kind of pushed us into these ideas of hyper individualism and acting as if we have no responsibility to each other. That's just not true. We're part of an ecosystem, and if we destroy the environment, we're going to destroy the ground which we stand upon. We ruin the whole thing. We destroy the web of life, and we're deeply interwoven in it. So there's no getting away from that. Like, we need to figure out how to be responsible and live sustainable. And we need to see our identity as interwoven with other people, with other animals, and with the planet. I'm also vegan. I've been vegan for 20 years. So I also try to minimize harm in the way that I eat. And it's not just eating, too. It's also about like the kind of materials that you buy and things like that. Earlier, you were talking about these different duties. That's a
Mhm.
type of deontological, moral logic. You said something about not causing harm. Well, they say that there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. Basically, anytime you buy anything in capitalism, you're participating in something potentially harmful. Maybe you could say it's a bit hyperbolic, but we don't need to get into the details of that. Yeah.
Let me answer that.
Yeah.
I think there's a way out of that, is that when we enter into society, realizing the conditions, that we only take what we need and then we work to help. It's not popular. This is not something that is popular to say, right?
Yeah, it's not just like, well, you're entitled to whatever you can get. It should be definitely an
Right.
idea about responsible interaction. And I think we should definitely hold people accountable for what they do with their time, their money, their energy. This goes back to the idea of social pressure. Like, you get respect
Mhm.
based on what you do with your life, what you do with your energy, what you do with your time. There's this idea of like footprint versus contribution. We should all maybe take a minute to think about that. Like, are we bringing value to the world with our existence in it? Are we contributing? Are we contributing more than we're taking? And if not, you might want to think about trying to lessen your footprint and expand your contribution. Really thinking about that. Like, am I worth it? People just have this idea of like, well, every person is inherently worthwhile. And maybe in terms of potential, that could be true, but in terms of actual ground value and contribution and the cost, in terms of cost
I mean,
benefit analysis, are you
there's
really,
thermodynamics going on, right? I mean,
yeah, are you really trying to be worth it? Maybe we should think about that. Our responsibility, our relationship to the world around us, and how we live in regard to it. That's the important parts of ethics. And maybe it's not as easy to just do black and white, but we should still, apply some utilitarian logic and try to do our best, try to do the best that we can with what we got and try to improve.
right, we should innovate. And I'm using should because these are ethical statements, right? I think we
Right?
should innovate. I think when we do something, we should do it well. Like take, for example, your recent video on non-reductionism. Very well done. We want to
Thank you, buddy.
do really well with what we do. I think that that's probably natural, but society can bring that out. We want experts to have what they need to do what they need to do. So there's going to be some inequality in society because, say, to train an airline pilot is more expensive than training a philosopher, like us. So
Yeah.
yeah, so there's going to be a little bit of inequality, but like you were saying, we don't want to have these wide things where, what is it, like 80 people now own half of the wealth, probably
Yeah.
the whole
And then
system,
other people are dying starving in the streets. It's shameful.
like dire straits.
Elon
Yeah.
Musk could end world hunger.
Right, one single person. I mean, all of his wealth's probably tied up in like different things, so he couldn't. If he took it out, then that would collapse. But anyway, yeah, theoretically,
Yeah. And he could
and
work on
and
definitely creating systems, putting systems in place
for,
to lift up lots of people. He doesn't even try to
ex
do that. So.
exactly, exactly, he could use his wealth to get that started and create those organizations. That's right.
Yeah. So the best
Uh,
thing that I feel like I can do with my time is to try to get this philosophy going, which will ultimately result in a movement. You know, a lot of people think about philosophers and philosophy as kind of this waste of time, pie in the sky, like talking about things endlessly that don't really matter. But I'm a practical philosopher. Like to me, all of this stuff matters. It matters for how we live. It matters for ourselves, for how we can become a more whole person. It matters for the kind of communities that we can create. It matters for how we can live together. And it matters right now historically that we actually
Yes.
get the best worldview that we can to be able to create the best system that we can to be able to uplift humanity and frankly save humanity from driving itself off the cliff and taking a lot of the life on this planet with it.
Right. And to respond to where we were actually headed there is eco-philosophy. I think that, like you were saying, when people say philosophy is just a bunch of words, yeah, I get it. As far as like academic seminars, I spoke at one recently, yeah, okay, we need that. But when we talk about philosophy, everybody does this. It's called social thought, just thinkers. And when you talk about humanity running itself off the cliff, that's why I come back and say eco philosophy is probably the most important philosophy that we need right now, and in a holistic view on
Yeah.
this. And then this relational self, the ethics of inequality and all of that, this has got to be addressed.
Absolutely. We're at that point in human history where this stuff is facts. It's not just some religious worldview that we're connected, that we're part of the ecosystem. It's proven. So to really continue to think that we're just isolated individuals and justify our endless consumption is just wrong and morally shameful. And we should really all know better. And I think a lot of people do know better. It's just that they don't know what to do about it. So they go out and they carry signs and they're like, they're still kind of appealing to mommy and daddy to fix it, but it's kind of up to us.
Right.
We need to stop asking for permission or like thinking that if we throw a fit that mommy and daddy are going to fix it. They're not. They're not going to help with this. They're committed to these systems as they are. You can't actually fix these systems from within. What we have to do is we have to create a new system that makes these old systems obsolete. There needs to be like a game B type strategy. Maybe at a certain point, if you can put enough pressure on the current system, there could be some kind of system that you're building on the outside, and then you get people on the inside as well, and then we can shake hands and kind of coalesce into each other. But basically, we need to work on creating a new system that makes the old system obsolete. And it's got to be rooted in philosophy, grounded philosophy, good tension processing, and good decision making. A lot of these most fundamental questions about how we live together, what is identity, what is morality, how do we manage resources, that's philosophy. So we need good philosophy to be able to fix these problems. It starts there.
Thank you so much. I've been speaking with David Long, a non-reductionist philosopher, founder of that movement. See you later.
Thanks so much, buddy. I appreciate you. If you're interested to learn more about non-reductionism, get plugged in, check out the YouTube videos, and join the community.